No matter what your life circumstances are, the message is, wake up.
Where does past guilt, which I think you're sort of referencing here, fit into this? Because we mentioned right before we started that I've been on tour with Jordan Peterson, and during the Q&As, I see so many people that will say to him, you know, I just read your book and I'm applying the 12 rules for life and my life is better, my relationship's better, I'm not doing drugs, whatever it may be. I've mended relationships, et cetera, but they have trouble getting over some sort of past guilt. And I think what you're describing here is the first step in getting away from that, but I think a lot of people think it's something that you can do like this.
Right.
But it's not.
No. You need to recognize where it comes from, how it arises in you. Of course, guilt is related to grievance. Well, when it refers to another person, it's a grievance. You have a resentment or a grievance towards another person. When it refers to yourself, then it's called guilt. But it always refers to something that either you did to somebody that you now recognize as bad in some way, not ethical. You did something, perhaps when you were younger, perhaps you brought up your children in a way that you now recognize as dysfunctional in some ways, or you injured somebody, or you inflicted suffering on somebody, whether it's emotional suffering, mental suffering, even physical suffering. In extreme cases, you might even have killed somebody in very extreme cases, and that brings about guilt. Now, guilt is something that you did that you now recognize as bad. This becomes a thought form in your head and becomes incorporated into your sense of self. What you don't realize is you did something because you didn't, your consciousness, your level of consciousness at that time manifested that kind of behavior. No human being can manifest behavior that's beyond their level of consciousness. So if you inflicted harm on somebody, the ego tends to then make it into an identity for yourself. And that brings about guilt when you see that this is your essential self is guilty. That can be a huge ego boost. It can also be a huge ego boost to declare somebody else as guilty and somebody who did something to me. So people carry a grievance or resentment sometimes for many, many years. And then again, what they are doing is they're transforming somebody's, I call it unconscious behavior, when you inflict suffering on another human being, except of course self-defense or whatever, but you inflict suffering on any life form or a human being, you do it, it's unconscious. As Jesus is supposed to have said on the cross, forgive them for they know not what they do. Translated into modern terminology is they are unconscious. They know not what they do. So people do all kinds of things, sometimes in states after they've taken drugs, they become even more unconscious, or they've consumed alcohol, makes you more unconscious, even more unconscious than normal unconsciousness. By unconscious, by the way, I perhaps need to explain what I mean by unconscious, which is in spiritual terms. In conventional usage, unconscious means obviously you're of lost consciousness. But in spiritual terms, unconscious means you are at the mercy of the conditioning of your mind and your emotions. The ways in which your emotions have been conditioned, you are being run by that conditioning. There's no way that this human being has any awareness of their conditioning. There's no awareness whatsoever. And a human being who has zero awareness, perhaps not throughout their lives, in moments when they are very unconscious, they get triggered by something, as I said, they take drugs, whatever, they become zero awareness, and then they do what they do. Later you look back on that and then you erroneously incorporate that time of your life when you weren't even there. You were run by an automatic program in your mind and in your emotional field. You weren't even there, But the ego will transform it into an identity and says, I did, this is now part of who I am. Or it will do to somebody else. There was a long time when I had resentment towards my father, because my father was pretty unconscious, except very late in life, had a very strong ego, and living with him as a child was living with an unexploded bomb that could go off at any moment. We got these intense rages would suddenly come several times a week. So I lived in a constant state of kind of background anxiety. When is this bomb going to explode again next? And then for a long time, in my 20s, I had a resentment towards him until I went to this shift in consciousness, and I suddenly realized he did what he had to do, but there wasn't enough awareness in him to act any different. So he was at the mercy of his own conditioning. And once you see that, you no longer make it into an identity for him, and so you free him. And really, perhaps this is the meaning of forgiveness. You can forgive yourself by not making unconscious behavior in your past into an identity for yourself or for somebody else. Now, a question may arise, this is an interesting point. Now, does that mean people are not really responsible for what they do? So that's an interesting question. In ultimate terms, it can say it is true they are not responsible for what they do, but they will have to suffer the consequences of their unconsciousness. Because we humans are meant to become more conscious here. And one of the ways, or even one of perhaps the main way in which a very unconscious human evolves eventually, or potentially, is by suffering the consequences of their unconsciousness. And sometimes the consequences might be they have to go to prison. It doesn't so, but it does, even if you meet a prisoner, it's important, if they did something in the past, let's say they killed somebody in the past, of course they have to suffer the consequences of their unconsciousness. But when you meet a human being like that, you may be able to sense that there's more to this human being than this unconscious person.
How does that play into your perspective on free will then?
Free will ultimately does not come in until there's some awareness in you. That's where free will comes from. Until you have some awareness, you are run by the conditioning of your mind. And so you have no choice. The element of choice comes in when you become aware, for example, of the thoughts that go through your head. And you might realize suddenly, and for some people that's the first time they awaken spiritually, when they realize that for years they've had a voice in their head talking to them, which could be a monologue, it could be a dialogue. You could have a conversation with yourself. You can beat yourself up and say, "Why you're no good enough, aren't you?" And then the other part of yourself says, "Well, I'm doing my best. I can't do it. I'm not good enough." The voice in the head. For some people, the spiritual awakening comes when they become aware that there's a voice in the head, and there's the awareness.
Right.
At the moment there's the awareness, you might even be able to choose to let go of a certain thought, a repetitive thought that you don't need anymore, that you don't want anymore, and then you surrender it, or you breathe it out. You don't need it. You reckon an emotion, sometimes people are in the grip of strong emotions, but if there's a little bit of awareness there, if let's say it's anger, anger arises, but in the background you're aware that there's emotion of anger. So there's a small element of choices come in. Do you want to then attack this person? If there's awareness, you can observe the anger, but may no longer need to act it out. I'm not talking about suppressing, but recognizing. The more awareness you have, or presence, the more choice there's in your life. And then it's only then that you actually become truly intelligent, because this awareness is not an IQ thing. You can have, I've met highly intelligent people with 1 or 2 or 3 PhDs, academics and others, were completely unconscious, completely unaware, still just completely in their minds. And people in their personal lives, often very dysfunctional personal lives. So it's not to be equated with intelligence, this awareness.
What do you make of that life, actually? So if there's someone that exists in that state all the time, but then becomes a world-changing scientist or mathematician or athlete or whatever it takes, they have to stay in that, whether it's consciously or not. They have to stay in that mode of thinking. What do you make of that life that maybe doesn't lock in to hearing the inner voice?
Well, it can be a very extremely unbalanced life. And no matter how intelligent they are, even people who there are some people who are very creative in one area, but the rest of their lives is completely unbalanced. And then some people are almost destroyed by the lack of balance in their lives, like famous people, like even some famous pop artists who are quite creative in the way. Michael Jackson, for example, as a person, he's passed away now, but I remember seeing him in an interview. As a person, he's just has got much to say, and he's timid, and but the moment he moves, he makes a dance movement, or just power flows through him, and I saw that. But the important thing is this creative intelligence needs to come into the rest of your life needs to become a work of art, a creative work of art, not just a little area in your life. So what the world needs is actually not more intelligence. It doesn't need more knowledge. I mean, we are drowning in facts and information. And we don't need more of that. To use an old-fashioned word, what the world needs is wisdom. Wisdom is inseparable from awareness. It arises out of awareness. Without wisdom, you are torn. You may be identified with the polarities of life. That perhaps worth mentioning here. You know the ancient yin and yang Chinese way of looking at the world. There's the yin is the feminine principle, and the yang is the masculine principle. So the polarities are everywhere in life. This is for Western mind, it's a very strange way of looking at things. But the Chinese philosophy, ancient Chinese philosophy, says there's a play of the world is a manifestation of the play between yin and yang, the feminine and masculine principles. You may remember the symbol of yin and yang.
Of course.
Here too, you can be in the grip of a particular energy movement. Without awareness, you can get into the grip of yang, and then you would become quite destructive if you go to an extreme. A country can be in the grip of yang energy, like Germany was, Russia, China. Any country where there's dictatorship is in the grip of an extreme grip of yang. Traditionally, society, at least in the West, has been dominated by the yang energy, with occasional interludes of yin in between, but relatively insignificant. For example, the Romantic movement in the 19th century in art and literature was some yin coming in, but not for too long. So,
would you put the Enlightenment as a yin state of being?
Enlightenment, there was a bit of yin coming in, yes. But the first half of the 20th century was an extreme manifestation of yang. The world wars, the genocide in Germany, in Russia, in China, Cambodia, and other places. Absurd unconsciousness, yang, of a yang. Then the world, the Western world especially, experienced as a reaction to the extreme yang, an influx of yin. It started in the 60s, actually, a very strong influx of yin. And with that came the women's movement and all those things. More empathy towards other human beings came in. Also an openness towards spirituality. More, instead of the rigid patterns of institutionalized religion, there was an openness towards an influx also of Eastern spirituality coming into the West. There was an empathy with this is where the empathy with the disadvantaged humans came from, an empathy to the suffering of people who are physically disabled, mentally disabled, or the so-called marginalized, all those things. This is a wonderful thing. Humans could sense their suffering, so more empathy came up, and this was a great thing and a necessary thing. Education changed completely from being dominated by the yang energy, discipline and yang, and now education became more and more permissive. You do your own things. It became so permissive that eventually there was no structure anymore at all, and schools became chaotic, and many families became totally chaotic. And so, and the wonderful empathy towards other human beings turned into political correctness. Quickly, the world was moving towards an extreme of yin to counterbalance, but there was no awareness. So people first were in the grip of the yang movement and identified with that as a collective. And now a significant portion of Western civilization, not all, but a significant portion of the population, is in the grip of a yin movement, and it's not stopping. It's going to an extreme where something that it was initially good and necessary now turns, anything that goes to an extreme becomes destructive. And another ancient saying in Greek philosophy is nothing in excess. Nothing in excess. So now the collective is in the grip, not all of it, but to give in part, especially the media, universities, and so on, are strongly in the grip of yin. Germany is an interesting example. They like to go to extremes. They were an extreme of yang. Mm-hmm. They became the most aggressive country in Europe. And now they're going into an extreme of yin. They are the most compassionate country in Europe, except Sweden. They open their borders completely. So please, we want to help you. This consists of two things. There is the compassion that arises when yin comes in. There is another element that needs to be mentioned. Yes, there's also guilt, which plays its part too. It's a combination of guilt and yin energy. So yin is symbolized as this. This is yin, receptive, open. This is yang. You can see yang is the masculine, the thrusting principle. It's almost a sexual yin, yang. So yang says, let's close the borders, or an extreme form of yang says, let's expand our country and then close the borders. Mm-hmm. Let's attack the neighboring countries and then we'll be even bigger. The extreme of yin says, no borders at all. And we can walk. And it feels so good to be able to say, how can we deny human beings who want a better life? How can we deny? It feels so wonderful to say that. But what's lacking is wisdom. Compassion is there, and it's wonderful. So you have yin and yang. What's missing is there needs to be, instead of two polarities, you need to be a triangle. At the apex of the triangle, you need to have awareness. If there's enough awareness, then you don't need to go to an extreme of either yin or yang.
You know, it's so interesting because I wasn't really planning on doing anything sort of political with you, but actually I think in the last few minutes you've given me as good political analysis to sort of where we are. So without getting into the nitty-gritty of politics, if your premise is basically right, and this is why I always say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The people that I'm frustrated with right now that you're describing as yin, I don't believe they're evil people. There can be bad actors within that, let's say, or people that aren't acting in their conscience, but I don't believe that the bulk of them are. No. But if we're right now, we're caught between this, how does the good, decent person that I think most people are, that can check in and out of their higher self and all of those things, but that want a decent world, how do we help these sides to get to that place?
Well, first you have to be careful with yourself so that you do not get drawn to either one or the other extreme. Because now the reactive mode of going too far into yin would be to go too far into yang. And so a society that goes totally into yin would produce fascism again. Mm-hmm. That's the danger. So the individual needs to be aware that they don't go into reactivity, so that you remain aware, so that you don't contribute to the polarization in the world. So what you contribute, whether it's on the social media or in person, when you speak to somebody or you write something, be careful that you do not confuse also somebody's mental, emotional position, which may be either there or there, with who they are, and then regard them as an enemy. The ego feels strengthened. The more enemies it can have, the stronger it feels. There's always the tendency, the unconscious ego, to make others into enemies. So we need to develop enough awareness to be able to conduct a conversation with another human being without regarding the other, who might hold very, very different mental positions, as an enemy. I was very happy to see recently, happened to see an interview on YouTube with a guy who has come quite a long way, Russell Brand, has come a long way with it. He's doing great things now. If anybody who hasn't seen him for a long time should see him again. He met with Candace Owens.
Oh, I saw it. And it's actually pretty incredible.
They had an interview. He's on the left, she's on the right. They were, in many ways, opposing and opposite viewpoints, respected each other as human beings without making the other into an enemy. That is a wonderful stuff. If they can do it, why can other people not do it? It just requires a little bit of awareness so that you can then have a conversation, and it's only by having a conversation that you can find somewhere a middle way. This is a Buddhist expression. Buddhism is called the middle way. Mm-hmm. You find the middle way somewhere. If we don't have conversations with others who have different viewpoints, then there will be deterioration, and eventually might even be violence.
So it's interesting because I know you talk a lot about the collective conscious, which obviously, I mean, look, you happen to see me on YouTube. That brought us here. Now your message can get out to, tons of other people and all of that stuff, which is absolutely incredible. So that's the great part of the internet that I think has fed the collective unconsciousness, unconscious. But then there's another part of it where we seemingly are just fighting all day long. And you mentioned before, we're distracted all day long. So if we're standing on a corner, we automatically go to our phone. Do you think that level of distraction and technology and our adolescence relative to knowing what is really going on by having the world in your pocket at all times, do you think that is leading us to a sort of strange existential crisis that actually could have never happened before, just because of the speed with which we can communicate and learn and hate and all of those things?
Yes. Well, there's both what is communicated through these devices, but the very fact that there is this device, many years ago there was a book by Marshall McLuhan that said the medium is the message. Mm-hmm. It was about television. But the nature of the device itself, we need to be very careful, because what it does is it contributes to the clutter of our minds. So no matter, potentially, it can be a very beneficial thing to connect with humans through these devices. But at the moment, the dangers that it might be destructive are greater. I can see what it does to children who, from an early age, interact with these. They're no longer able to have personal relationships. Increasing number of children have attention deficit disorder. Now, what is attention deficit disorder? They can't focus on anything for very long anymore. Mm-hmm. What does that do to human consciousness? What does it do to a civilization if humans grow up now without the ability to focus on attention for very long? Because any creative act requires you to be present with something for a period of time, to give it attention. And if humans lose the ability to give attention, then they lose the ability to be creative. If they lose the ability to be creative, they lose the ability even to solve their problems, because the problems that they have created, it requires wisdom and true creativity to solve those problems. So all kinds of scenarios are possible. The scenario of a breakdown of civilization within 2 generations is a possibility. But these things, if these things we need to learn how to use these devices in the same way that we have to learn how to use our minds, because they are an extension of our minds. So if we become more aware of what our mind is doing, then it might be easier also to handle these devices, because they are an extension and amplification of the mind. And the dysfunction that we see on the internet with all these dysfunctional behavior and so on is it's an externalization and an amplification of the dysfunction of the human ego. Mm-hmm. You can just see it much more clearly now. It's all for everybody to see. And that might be a good thing to see it, because then we can really aware of it. What are we doing to ourselves? That's a good question to ask. What are we doing to ourselves? This is becoming insane. And the moment you see that it is insane, then there's some sanity in you, because nobody who knows they're insane is completely insane. Mm-hmm. The really insane people don't know they're insane. So if you see the insanity in the way that we collectively communicate, you say, okay, I'm not going to be part of that. It's necessary to see it. And then your responsibility as an individual is not to feed it, to stay conscious, to stay present, so that your input is conscious and does not seek to destroy other human beings and dehumanize and demonize other human beings.
So you view that really as the antidote, let's say, to the mob culture that we have, because there is this, you can feel this. You know, it's funny. This morning I was scrolling your Twitter feed, and your Twitter feed is basically a breath of fresh air. It's like, when I was reading it, there's like a breath, and it's pleasant, and you know, there's some of your sayings and some of the ways that you want to help people think clearly and all those things. But that's so the reverse of the way most of Twitter is, and I'm part of that other world, and sometimes I feed it, and I try not to, but you know, I'm not perfect either. But I do see this thing where the mob is sort of moving around on Twitter, and sometimes it comes to get me too. Yes. And there's an innate human feeling. You see something, and it has a lot of attention, and it's shiny, and it's whatever, and that everyone wants to get in. But basically you're saying, if you would take that breath, if you would just say, I don't want in on this, that eventually you can almost pull other people out of it too by your own behavior.
Yes.
Because this isn't just about you.
Yes. Also not to feed if other people post negative things about you. In many, many cases, non-reaction is the best thing instead of feeding it.
That's a lesson I need to learn. I will try to take that one with me.
That applies both offline and online. In your personal life too, often it's just, well, I believe Jesus was talking about non-reaction when he talked about turning the other cheek. I don't think it's to be taken literally, but it means when somebody attacks you, not physically, it's an analogy he uses. It's a parable. Turn the other cheek means just be free of reaction. and that very quickly deflates even the other person's ego. It doesn't. The ego needs the reaction. It needs the reactivity. So that's a powerful thing.
But how do you avoid then just becoming a pushover within that?
Well, in some situations, something needs to be said. But even then, that can come from, you could say, especially if you're with somebody, that kind of behavior is unacceptable. You can say that in a conscious way rather than in a destructive and aggressive way. One can actually be very firm and conscious, or when you say no to somebody, it doesn't have to be aggressive. It's just a clear, I call it a high quality no. Somebody says, can you lend me again? I've $2,000 I need. I know I still owe you 20,000, but I need some more. And then not to make the other into an enemy, just, no, I'm sorry, can't do it anymore. It's a high quality no. That's you're present while you say it. And then you can set boundaries if necessary. So in some cases, something needs to be said, we need to do something, but in many other cases, complete non-reactivity can be very, very powerful.
What gives you the most amount of joy in your life now?
The little things in life, the little things, walking around in nature, sometimes sitting quietly in a room, just being. I love being. Nature, I still enjoy traveling, and the greatest joy is teaching, giving talks, because that's my life purpose. And so every time I'm engaged in my life purpose, then I'm really in a state of joy and heightened aliveness. And that's why I'm still doing it.
Yeah. Would you say are you an optimist inherently?
As far as human destiny is concerned, you mean, or humanity, or in general?
Yeah, I don't mean it personally, actually. I mean it just in the wider world. Are you hopeful?
Oh yes, well, I sometimes call it, I'm a long-term optimist.
I always say world-weary optimist.
Short-term, I don't know. It's possible. Who knows where humanity is going right now? Nobody could predict where it's going. The individual can only take responsibility for their own state of consciousness, but that matters very much. Because your state of consciousness determines the way in which you experience reality. And that has many repercussions. You affect many other humans through your state of consciousness. So don't underestimate the importance of your state of consciousness in the present moment.
There's so much more we could do here, but I want to be respectful of your time, so I'll ask you one more, and then when we end this, I'm going to beg you to come back. But if someone's watching this right now and is really in what Jordan Peterson would describe as the state of chaos, or the state that you were in your late 20s before you had your awakening, and they hear you and they say, well, just taking that first breath isn't going to do it. If they're really just out of sorts right now, what would be some way that you think you could help shake them out of it? Give them something concrete that would help them stop on this thing and fix themselves, or begin the process, let's say.
Yeah. Well, the best starting point is the present moment. Now, whatever I say, any advice I give, it's quite possible, if not likely, that their conditioned mind will deny what I say, and it'll say, that's not going to work. Mm-hmm. So don't believe what I say now. If your mind says this is not going to work, don't believe what your mind says, just try what I'm saying now. So become more fully conscious of the present moment right now, because that's all there ever is. Your entire life is experienced and unfolds in the present moment. Most humans don't seem to even realize that, because they always live as if some other moment were more important than this one. You need to honor this moment. It's the basis for the future, how that unfolds, which never comes, because when it comes, it's the now. And the past never happened except when you remember it. It's always, and you remember it now. So come into the present moment. Be aware of your breathing. And another one I recommend anybody, this is actually very powerful, it sounds almost too simple, but it's very powerful. Feel the aliveness inside your body. And if you don't know what I mean, usually I advise people to close their eyes, hold their hand like this, and ask themselves, without looking at my hand or moving my hand, how can I know whether my hand is still there? That question requires you to direct attention into your hand. And then after a few seconds, you'll probably feel a little bit of a tingling or aliveness in your hand. That is the beginning of being able to feel what I call the inner body. This is the energy field that pervades every cell in the body. If you can start with the hands, then you feel your legs, your feet, your hands simultaneously, and then you incorporate the totality of your body, and so your attention is moved from your mind, you've taken consciousness into the body. So one could say you're now inhabiting your body consciously. And when it's a very lovely feeling, and you'll notice that you're no longer thinking very much. You can't. And all the problems that you have, to a large extent, were created by dysfunctional thinking and the emotions that accompany dysfunctional thinking. Most of the problems reside in your mind. So if you are able to become more present, then you access a higher or deeper dimension of consciousness. And to become more present, you have to be able to step out of your mind without losing consciousness. So the consciousness goes into the body, and the body becomes an anchor. You can hold it for several minutes at a time, becomes an anchor for being present. Become as present as you can, also present of sense perceptions. It's very important. Sense perceptions can also bring you into the present moment. An expression you could use is come to your senses, in both meanings of the word expression. Come to your senses, look around, consciously take everything in without needing to label it mentally. And then you're aware of your surroundings. You're aware of your inner energy field. You're in the present moment. And in the present moment, there's no problem. There's no an emergency sometimes, yes, then you have to act. But it's not an emergency. Here's no problem. Then your ability to deal with your so-called problems becomes much greater if you're able to access the power of your presence. Then when you choose to deal with your problems, say, okay, now I apply focused thought. What can I do? And then you return to presence. It's always going, thinking, back into, learn what presence is. It's there, it's, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, said Jesus. It's right here. It's right here, don't look for it elsewhere. And then you realize a lot of the unhappiness in one's life, the Buddha called it dukkha, suffering. He says every human suffers unless they have awakened. And a lot of the suffering is not due to your life circumstances, although most people think it is. The larger part of your suffering is due to your mental commentary about your life circumstances. Your mind is telling you something that creates the unhappiness. Even you can test it out even in a simple situation. You're in line somewhere, you get irritated, it's taking too long, you're waiting. You get very angry and irritated. And then experiment, how would I experience this situation without adding any thought to it? Mm-hmm. If I didn't add any thought to this moment, and then suddenly, oh, it's actually fine. It's not, before you were unhappy, but you were not unhappy because you had to wait, you were unhappy because of the narrative in your mind. So there are millions of people who carry very toxic narratives in their mind, and they call it my life. that's not, it's a terrible burden they carry around. It doesn't have to be like that. And the essence of all spirituality is to be able to step out of that, realize if only a little bit of self-transcendence, which is inner spaciousness, and then that grows. And then you can begin to sense there is a power in you that transcends the person. And that is also the place where you can transcend the feelings of happiness and unhappiness, which fluctuate continuously. I'm not saying it's not happiness that you ultimately find. Happiness is a little bit superficial. Hey, yeah, I made it. And the next day you're the opposite. It's something that transcends happiness and unhappiness. It's a deep sense of rootedness in being, of a deep sense of inner peace that really has nothing much to do with your personal circumstances. I've had letters from people in prison who have written to me, said, I feel free now because I've read your book and I've practiced it, and my life is transformed, and now I'm teaching others. I've had many letters from prisoners. So it's no matter what your life circumstances are, the message is wake up out of complete identification with your mind. And so that's the ultimate purpose in life, is to awaken.
This has been an absolute pleasure. I think that I know that I had a few of those brief fleeting moments while we were here, and I thank you for that. And I think if my audience gets even 1% of that through the internet waves that go out there, I think this will be something that I will always remember. I hope we can do this again, because we just started here. I normally tell the Twitter handle of my guest, but in this case, I'm going to look at the camera and tell you guys just to take a breath.